For those of you not familiar with Northwest Children's Fund, we're a public foundation established 28 years ago. We work hard to end the cycle of child abuse and neglect, and we do this in two ways. First of all, we invest in programs for at-risk kids and their families in the form of grants. And the second way we do this is that we inspire informed philanthropy through our educational and outreach programs like this one. Today, we're excited to bring you information about how the ACEs research has informed and influenced the ways direct service organizations work with struggling children and their families. Especially because we have only 2 hours available to us today, I'd like to tell you what today's forum is and what it isn't. Let me start with what it's not. It's not a comprehensive conference on the subject, nor is it a survey of all the ACEs research. Or it's also not a continuing education class on ACEs and related brain research. What we do hope to share with you today is a conversation about the ACEs research, including some breaking news for Washington State, and also describe the 3 ways 3 remarkable organizations are using the ACEs research and related neuroscience to make choices on how to build resilience for our highest risk children and their parents. So why should we care about the ACEs research? Why do we care? Well, one of the lessons that we've learned about ACEs is that what's most required is community collaboration, and that we as a society need to better understand the knowledge that's embedded in the ACEs data so that we can put into place structures that can mitigate ACEs in our society. This is how we can have a profound effect on our future, for our children's children, and for society as a whole. The agencies that you'll be hearing from today provide us with illustrations of some of the ways that this is taking place. The fact that all of us are sitting here today is just another example. This is truly it takes a village stuff. We're thrilled to be part of it, along with you. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what's going to happen today. First, we'll have a presentation from our ACEs expert, Laura Porter, and then we'll hear from 3 organizations that will illustrate the distinct ways that they use their research, use the ACEs research in their work. Then we hope to have ample time for Q&A. You'll notice on your table, move your boxes, lunch boxes away, and you'll find that there are some cards there and pens. If you have a question during this time, please write it down, legibly of course, and a little bit later there'll be a Northwest Children's Fund board member that will be collecting those cards for the Q&A time. Following Northwest Children's Fund's public forum, there'll be a separate, much smaller event that starts at 2:15 for members of Philanthropy Northwest and other grant makers. That's going to be taking place over there. The reason I bring this up is it's a little bit confusing. We have 2 separate events in the same location. But our event, the forum, open to you all, ends promptly at 2. Okay, now for our program. I'd like to introduce to you our keynote speaker and moderator, Laura Porter. Laura serves as a director of ACE Partnerships for Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services. She works with state managers and community leaders to incorporate the ACEs research and related neuroscience into policy and practice. Northwest Children's Fund was fortunate some time ago to have Laura come talk to us about ACEs at a board meeting. We recognized the importance of this framework to our own grant-making decisions as we identify and fund effective programs that support those who have high ACEs scores. So with that, I'd like to begin the program by inviting Laura to come up to the podium.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me here. I wonder how many of you thought, I'm going to go to a forum about adverse childhood experience, and it's going to be focused on the magnitude of the problem. That's kind of a typical way of thinking about it. But we're going to surprise you today, because we're all about the magnitude of the solution. And over the course of this talk and the examples that our 3 organizations are going to give, I hope you see that we're standing in a time in history with unprecedented opportunity to improve the health of everyone for generations to come. It's really a public health discovery of the magnitude of discovering that bacteria was carried in water when we solved the cholera epidemic in Europe in the 1850s. We stand at a moment when we understand so much about how to shift the trajectory of the public's health for generations to come. One reason that we're at such an amazing time is that there's an explosion of neuroscience findings coming out every day, every week, every month. It's hard to keep up with them all. And a part of my role with the state of Washington has been to kind of scan that literature and try to keep track of major findings and then make them accessible to the general public. Because in any major public health discovery era, there are two things that always have to happen. One is we have to tell everyone, and two is we have to act from the future that we want to live in. And those will be themes throughout my talk today, because all of us in this room can do those two things. We can all tell everyone at the close of this forum. You'll have plenty of information to do that. And we can all begin to act from an ACE-informed frame for doing work. Now, in neuroscience, you've probably familiar with neuroscientists that really specialize in studying the optimal development of the brain. But the information I'm going to share with you today is from a different group of neuroscientists that study what happens when the brain is affected during development by toxic stress, specifically by maltreatment. And there are many neuroscientists studying that, but we've pulled from Dr. Bruce Perry, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Martin Teicher. And a lot of the specific information is from Marty Teicher's work. Dr. Teicher works at Harvard in charge of neurobiology and biopsychiatry research there and at McLean Hospital. And he's reviewed all of the summary information in this presentation because sometimes when you summarize very dense neuroscience, you can get it wrong. So I can assure you that he said that it's pretty close to right, although it is very simplified. So I want to start first with a really key notion that there's now broad agreement in the neuroscience field about, and that is that when we're born, from the first moment of life, that first tiny beating heart and that fragile skeleton development, that we are constantly evolving, we are constantly adapting to our experience. That human beings are, I believe, miraculously made to adapt to the world that our bodies believe we will live in throughout our lifetime. And so when I was in college studying sociology, they used to call some kinds of behaviors maladaptive. And neuroscience now is challenging that concept and saying there's a magnificent dance of experience and adaptation and experience and adaptation that happens throughout childhood on a moment-to-moment basis and develops the neurological basis for how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we relate to the world around us. So I've tried to simplify this in terms of two tracks here, that at conception, we really start with pretty close to a neutral start. Some people would argue there's already toxic stress chemicals in the sperm and the egg, but just for simplification, pretty neutral start. And our experience creates predictable patterns in our chemical functioning, our electrical functioning in the brain mass, the development of mass in each of the brain regions, and the expression of our genes. And for children that grow up on the upper track here, the track in which the context for life is toxic stress. Now, toxic stress we think of as when major stressors that cause fear or panic or those kinds of extreme emotion stay up and they flood the body with stress chemicals, including cortisol, for long periods of time. So that's what I mean by toxic stress, is either stress that stays intense for a long period of time or is episodic. And so you never know when the next danger is coming. And so those kinds of conditions create high levels of stress hormones and other brain chemicals. So people that grow up in this toxic stress path develop predictable characteristics and traits. They can become more competitive, more impulsive, more hypervigilant, always watching for when the next thing might be coming that they would need to protect themselves from. Hyperreactive, or very focused, hard to switch gears when something new comes up. Or some people respond by being withdrawn and emotionally detached and numb. And those responses are all normal adaptations to toxic stress during certain developmental phases. And children that grow up in a protective context can develop these characteristics of being pretty laid back, pretty relationship-oriented, very trusting, reflective. They can shift focus very easily and seize opportunities when they come along. And they'll use process over power. Now, as I said, I was taught that one track was maladaptive, this upper track. But actually, how many of you have raised girls? And if you raise them in a very protective environment, there were probably moments in time where we wished they had been really watching more for danger. And we had to intentionally teach them the skills to do well in parts of the world that do have dangers, and to be able to use those skills at a moment's notice. So we taught them and we practiced with them. And I would submit to you that that's the next step for society with people that adapt normally to toxic stress. We all need to get better at helping teach the kinds of skills and the kinds of abilities that help people do well, even if they grow up in an environment with toxic stress. I'm all about accommodation, that every person has a value, every person's core gift that they bring into life should have a place in society. And the better we get at understanding what skills we teach, what practices we can do with one another so that there's more space for everyone to help, the stronger a society will have and the more healthy we will all be. So Dr. Teicher studies the effect of maltreatment on brain development, and this type of study is about individuals. He's studying individual brains. And he's found that there are three main variables that lead to the outcomes. One is the type of experience. Our brains actually respond developmentally differently to different kinds of experience. Another is gender. Different kinds of toxic stress affect boys differently than girls, and there are different timing for those effects. And the third is age. Whoop. Sorry. This is a, hey, where's my, there it is. Okay. The third is age. Brand new, lovely gift. Thank you. I'm still learning how sensitive it is, which is fabulous. So why would age make a big difference? It's because brains develop sequentially. So think about it. When you're first born, you don't really need to be able to take a math test. You need to be able to regulate your breathing. You need to be able to sleep and wake. You need to be able to attach to a caring adult who will protect you, and some other things as well. And as we grow, we need to be able to pick up more and more abilities in order to have age-appropriate competencies. So as that development unfolds, we have experience at every day, at every turn. And in early childhood, those experiences are particularly powerful because they're developing the foundation in the brain, the mass, the functioning, the chemical interaction in the brain, the foundation that will, the future behaviors will all build upon. So that foundation is extremely important. And in early childhood, we begin to see the development of the limbic system. And two brain regions in the limbic system that are particularly noteworthy are the hippocampus and the amygdala. And they work together. So when there's danger, the amygdala tells the brain, ramp up, be ready. And the hippocampus tells the brain, calm down, it's okay. So those two work in tandem together. And when toxic stress causes the amygdala to constantly ramp up, pretty soon the hippocampus says, we better just stay ramped up and doesn't calm down. And small amounts of stress can have a powerful effect and be perceived as crisis in a person's life who's had toxic stress in early childhood. So I've put here some of the consequences of toxic stress in childhood, and they have a profound impact. Our verbal memory, our spatial memory, our emotional reactions to what comes in our life. And so the hippocampus is what puts the brakes on an emotional outburst. So if the hippocampus has gotten tired, it doesn't put the brakes on emotional outbursts. So if you know someone who has a hard time, once they start ramping up emotionally, they have a hard time stopping that ramp up. It's possible that in early childhood something happened that caused them to adapt in that way. In middle childhood, around 7 to 10, age 7 to 10, there are significant impacts to the corpus callosum, the superhighway that connects the right and left parts of the brain. And we see impacts to the communication, which is necessary for example, integrating language and math, which we all had to do when we did story problems, but we also do in our daily life. The connection between the right-left brain is critical for complex thinking, for making meaning from symbols like letters and numbers. Also in middle childhood, we can see our ability to move through physical space impacted, and our ability to navigate our surroundings. In fact, I've met extremely successful individuals who've come and spoken at our events who've said, my middle childhood was incredibly difficult, and so I will need someone to walk me through the hotel to make sure I arrive at the right place. And that's a good example of, can we create a world in which we could just say, I have a hard time with spatial memory and I have a hard time navigating physical space, so that one chunk is the piece that I need. It doesn't mean that there's a lack of intelligence. It means that there's just a need for a team to be built. Now, early childhood is such a significant period for development and for adaptation. But it's not the only period. In middle childhood and again pre-puberty and into adolescence, there are significant impacts on brain development from toxic stress. So those impacts are long-term memory, our attention. So some of the origins of ADHD and ADD come from impacts of toxic stress in this period. And our ability to have goal-oriented action. Some people call it executive function. Executive function is built from the earliest period of time when we're practicing things like working memory and delays in getting the things that we want the most. Those are good practices, but each of these phases builds. And one thing that's exciting to me about this science is that executive function, our ability to have goal-oriented, goal-directed behaviors in our life, continues to develop into our 30s. So the windows of opportunity for repair, for using the brain circuitry and practicing these kinds of things goes well into early adulthood. Toxic stress has enduring impacts. We were talking at our table about the fact that we would all like to say that because someone experienced trauma in childhood and then they had a really great something, a great new family or a great therapeutic experience or whatever, that somehow that would erase the effects. But it doesn't. Life has actually changed, but it can still be a great life. So that individual has adapted in various different ways to toxic stress. And it's really important that people understand and can talk about how that stress has affected them throughout their lives. Just the act of reflecting on that effect can have a powerful healing effect on people. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the adverse childhood experience study. And the reason I'm saying switch gears is that the brain science is about studying individual brains. But this science is about the population as a whole and how toxic stress in childhood affects population-level health. So please resist the temptation to think about the ACE study in terms of a diagnostic. It is not a diagnostic. If you know someone's ACEs, you really don't know anything about what might occur in their life in terms of health and social functioning. ACEs are predictive of the population's patterns in health and well-being throughout the lifespan. So it's a very different way to think, but it's a critical way to think if we want to affect policy, if we want to affect the changes to whole systems of programming. Then we have to understand how the population is really doing. And I want to just take a moment to say that we have stunning data in our state that says that communities like you who come together to learn about the truth of the dynamics of what's going on, the truth of how children are affected by the experience in their lives, communities that gather in this way are more successful in reducing the rates of major social problems. So you've taken a critical step today in coming together and learning together and being courageous enough to really look at the facts. These facts can be emotionally challenging for people. None of us wants to know that severe adversity during childhood is common in the population. But I can assure you that we've given this talk, and my colleagues throughout the state given talks similar to this for well over a decade. And what we hear from people is it might be emotionally difficult at times, but it's worth it, and it can feel like a relief that finally someone actually sees my life and the life of other people who have experienced stress like mine. So when Dr. Vince Folletti was at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, and Dr. Rob Anda was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, they imagined the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And at that time, Dr. Rob Anda was in the leading group of scientists. In fact, he won international awards for being on the team that developed our nation's strategy for reducing heart disease. And at that time, those strategies were all about impacting the risk so that we could reduce disease, so that we could prevent death. That was only in the early 90s. And now we're talking about a completely different paradigm, really. So if it's a little difficult to shift from all of your training about focus on reducing risk to a different model, that's because it's happening very fast. We're being asked by the science to adjust in ways that might be challenging for our brains and how our brains have adapted to the pace of learning. What they noticed was the risks that led to heart disease and cancer and other major medical problems were not random in the population. Instead, they showed up in risk pockets in the population, which meant to these scientists that something had to be driving the risk. So they theorized that perhaps adverse childhood experience was leading to social, emotional, and cognitive, at that time they called it impairment. At this time we would call it adaptation. Science has changed that fast to understand that. ACEs leading to cognitive and emotional and social adaptation, leading to the risks and on up to early death. And this was the theory behind the study. It's the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 participants. Over 100 peer-reviewed articles have been written on the study, and it's both a study where people gave self-reports and they also gave access to their medical records for the rest of their lives. So it is an ongoing study. New analysis is being done at the CDC every year to learn more about the lifespan and the health patterns of these study participants. Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda imagined what kinds of toxic stressors might be in a household that they could study. And they imagined these 10 things. 3 kinds of abuse, 2 kinds of neglect, and then these indicators of family dysfunction. So they looked at having a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in the home, having a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member. They looked at parental discord as evidenced by divorce or separation or abandonment. They looked at witnessing domestic violence against the mother. And when we show you Washington's data, our question is against the mother or any household member witnessing violence. And then they looked at incarceration of any family member. And what they found was astounding. First, they found that adverse childhood experience, these 10 categories, are extremely common in the population. And they started thinking, okay, well, we should study them one at a time. Each one probably has a significant impact, and we have to figure it out. And when they started doing that, what they noticed was they almost never come in singles. 87% of people who have one ACE have at least another. So they started saying, why would we research only the 13%? Why wouldn't we research the additive impact, the cumulative impact of having many categories of adverse childhood experience? And that's what really separates this study from many studies about these particular variables, is understanding the cumulative impact of all 10 of these. So I'm going to fast forward. In our state, we had the great privilege to have Vince Folletti and Rob Anda and Marty Teicher speaking regularly for close to a decade every year. And along the course of that period of time, we realized that we had to have our own data, that we couldn't keep on citing the Kaiser Permanente data, because audiences would say, well, what about here in Washington? What about us, the people of Washington? And so we had dialogues with a major foundation in the state who funded adding the questions, the adverse childhood experience questions, to the telephone survey of adults that is done in every state in the nation. It's called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System Survey, and people call it the BRFIS because those are its initials. So if you hear people say BRFIS, that means the telephone survey of adults. It's a random household sampling survey where they randomly dial the household, an adult or a child, whoever answers the phone, and they ask who are the members of the household, and they randomly select one member to interview. And it's designed so that you can add years of data together. So we began adding a standard module about adverse childhood experience to the BRFIS in 2009. And at that time, we were one of the first 5 states in the nation to do that. We since have added that, those questions to the BRFIS in 09, 10, and 11. We are the only state in the nation that added 3 years in a row. And the reason that that's important is we now have a large enough survey sample to be able to do analysis at the county, at the school district, and clusters of zip code levels. So we're now going to be able to look at sub-areas within the state and look at where people might need some extra help because of their experience and adaptation during childhood. That's really breaking news for the nation, and we're getting a lot of press about it. In fact, the Institute of Medicine just endorsed our use of data recently in a major CDC report. So we're standing at a time where we have really a lot of data, and we need more and more people telling us what you want to learn from the data, which is one opportunity for me by being in the room with you today. So what are we seeing in the Washington data? Well, we're seeing ACEs are common. 62% have at least one kind of ACE out of those 10 categories. 26% have 3 or more, and 5% have 6 or more. It's interesting to note that that's almost exactly the prevalence in the Kaiser Permanente sample. That surprised us because we thought San Diego, all health insured, all employed, we thought they might have a different ACE profile. But in fact, Washington adults, on the whole, very much the same prevalence of ACEs. The other thing we saw that's the same as in the study is the number of categories of ACEs leads to the amount of disease in a population. So this, in epidemiology, is a classic dose-response relationship. So the number of ACE categories drives the response, the occurrence of health and social and relational problems in life. And in epidemiology, there's a gold standard for inferring cause that Sir Bradford Hill developed. And this study meets all 9 tests. But the only one I talk about is the dose response test because we can so visually see it in the charts and graphs. Epidemiologists don't generally say this causes this. They'll say we can infer cause because this meets all 9 tests in epidemiology for inferring cause. So I'm going to show you some charts starting with some risks for health effects in the population. And we read these charts all in the same way. So I'm going to walk you through this first one, and then I'm going to ask you just to watch for the pattern. So along the bottom of the chart, these are numbers of adverse childhood experience categories. This is the group of people who said they had 0, the group of people who said they had 1 of those categories, 2, 3, 4 or 5, and 6, 7, or 8. And the vertical axis is the percent of population that reported whatever the subject is, in this case, current smoking. So in this chart, we see this dose-response pattern. The lower the ACE score, the lower the current smoking rate. The higher the ACE score, the higher the current smoking rate. Going from 10% of the population, this was in 2009, saying of the population that said they had 0 ACEs were currently smoking, all the way to 28.5, almost 3 times the risk of current smoking for the people who reported high ACEs. Now remember, this is after a long period of time of unprecedented investments in preventing smoking and helping people to stop. So when you see this kind of relationship between childhood trauma and smoking, it's in the context of having invested tremendous amounts of money to reduce smoking. So in the next charts, I'm going to move a little more quickly because they all read the same way. And I just want you to notice the pattern. Here we see heavy drinking from 4% among people with 0 ACEs to 8.4%. It doubles the risk of heavy drinking. This slide, I have permission from Rob Anda to show you. We start with people who say they ever had a drug problem. This is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, 4 and 5 or more. And you see the same dose response pattern between people who ever had a drug problem, ever were addicted to drugs, and ever injected drugs. And in this ever injected drugs, Rob had to force the numbers in order to have anything visual show up at the 0, because he thought the chart would be confusing if there wasn't any green bar at all. It's actually very close to no people report ever taking a needle and shooting up a drug if they had 0 ACEs. So we go to chronic disease, the relationship between ACEs and chronic disease. We go to about a doubling between 0 ACEs and high ACE populations. The same dose-response relationship to cancer, to diabetes, and to asthma. I've just given you a few examples, but because toxic stress during development is changing the actual electrical, chemical, brain mass, and genetic expression of your command center for your body, of course it makes sense it would change the way your cells and your body mechanisms work. A large portion of mental illness is attributable to adverse childhood experience. And I didn't give you charts for this entire list here, but these charts would look pretty much the same as these two, with just under 2% with 0 ACEs saying that they suffer from anxiety, all the way to 15% of people with 6, 7, or ACEs saying they suffer from anxiety. And one of the best indicators that we can use in the BRFIS for mental illness is whether people are using medications or treatment for mental illness, because it means there's a third party who's agreed that that condition exists. So I added this chart so you could see about 7% of people with 0 ACEs reported receiving treatment for a mental health condition. Over 3 times that many reported receiving treatment at the 6, 7, 8 ACE level. We see those same kinds of dose response charts for serious and persistent mental illness, including mental illnesses that carry with them hallucination. So this isn't just about mood disorder, it's about the way our brains and bodies perceive reality and experience life. Again, this slide is from Rob Anda. In the BRFIS, you can't really call someone up on the phone and say, and if you try to commit suicide, you're probably not going to get a great response. In the same way that you can't really call them up and say, have your children been physically abused? You know, it's kind of awkward. So there's some questions we can't really ask in BRFIS, so we rely on the original study for those, and this is one of them. The relationship between ACEs and suicide is one of the strongest correlations. This and using IV drugs are the two strongest correlations. And you see here just about 1% of people with 0 ACEs ever tried to commit suicide, and almost 1 in 5 of people with 4 or more ACEs have attempted suicide during their lifetime. These are adults. We're interviewing adults. So new information from Washington where we're able to look at worker performance. I wasn't able to bring to you some of the newest data because it's not in charts yet, but we will be rolling out data on worker injury and those kinds of things. But what we have for you today is the blue bars are the number of people the percent of people who said they couldn't go to work because of mental or physical health problems. With 0 ACEs, just about 4% said they lost 10 or more days in the last month and couldn't do their work. About 8.5% with 3 ACEs, and 20% of people with 6 or more ACEs said that they lost 10 or more days in the last month, a third of the month, when they couldn't do their work due to their physical or mental health challenges. These gold bars are about activity limitation. So not being able to do usual activities, not just work, but all sorts of activities, including our hobbies, our faith participation, going to the market, etc. And we see that same dose-response relationship there. We've been really curious in our state about how ACEs are transmitting from one generation to the next. And I'm not going to take a lot of time on this slide. I just want to deliver the punchline here. In the adult population, 26% of adults say they have 3 or more ACEs. In the high school population of 10th graders, 42% are estimated to have 3 or more ACEs. We know that ACEs will escalate generation to generation for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to go into today. And we see this escalation. The burden that our high schoolers are holding is tremendous. We can see also in the Washington data this stress life course that occurs, where people who experience toxic stress in early childhood and middle childhood more likely to either be bullied or bully others in school and have those kind of peer difficulties. And then we can see in the adult data, they're more likely then to be homeless, to experience incarceration, to be extremely poor, and have other adult adverse experiences. And we notice the health effects on people who didn't have very many ACEs as children, but became homeless for some reason. Not a lot of health effects there. Versus the people who had both ACEs and adult adverse experience, we see an escalation of the health effects. So there's a risk for intergenerational transmission, and we've intentionally added questions to the risk factor survey to learn about that. And we've added these questions on mental illness, drugs and alcohol, divorce, and incarceration, because we can't really ask about the other. And I want you to know this, you're the first to know this, that parenting adults that have 3 or more ACEs are 400% more likely to be passing multiple ACEs on to their children. So that gives us this amazing leverage point for helping families to do well. Because understanding our ACEs isn't really about the negative. What? That slide? We'll be publishing more about that as we get deeper understanding of the data, but we know this much so far. So we turn our attention to resilience, because understanding how ACEs are transmitted from one generation to the next means we also understand how we interrupt that transmission. And we've talked for years and years and years about interrupting the cycle without fully understanding the dynamics that are driving the cycle. So as we understand the dynamics and we can actually see the numbers in the population, we'll be able to see numbers all the way down into the school district and neighborhood levels. We'll be able to really target our work on resilience very carefully. And the neurobiologists say that these sensitive developmental periods are phenomenal windows of opportunity. Resilience researchers talk about 3 different factors that are critical for building resilience. One is developing individuals' capabilities. The second is building attachment and belonging in life. Even if it didn't happen in childhood, if it happens later in life, it's still a phenomenal benefit. And the third is creating the context for well-being in community, culture, and spirituality. These key components of resilience are all over the resilience literature. So I could give you a long, long list of details, but if you just remember these 3 and you're working on these 3, you will be making a big difference in the lives of families and in the lives of children. In our data, we're measuring these factors in the BRFAS. We're looking at hope and positive view and social emotional support, and we're just off the press as a new resilience factor about the number of people you can count on for help. And we're also measuring capacity building processes in our state and noting where we're building community and processes for supporting people's health and well-being, do we have better results? So there's 2 main goals I want to talk about. And I think if we can focus on these goals, even to thread a small amount of our efforts, you don't have to change everything you do to be ACE informed. In fact, you probably don't need to change much of what you do. But if we can all thread a small amount of this science through our work, we should see a massive shift in health. And I think the focus, my personal view is the focus should be on moderating the effects of ACEs among teens and adults who already have the ACE score they're going to have. So we can't erase the ACEs, but we can help them have a better life. And in protecting and preventing the buildup of ACEs in the lives of children. The wonderful thing about these 2 goals is they set up a virtuous cycle. The better we moderate effects in ways that can prevent ACEs in children, the lower the ACEs will be in the population. The lower the ACEs, the less effects. And we get this positive cycle. We've talked about sustainability in the nonprofit and public world in a different way than this in past years. But I think this is the ultimate of sustainability, where we invest in a way where the cycle builds itself. And we move from a time where we have a negative spiral to the time where we have a positive spiral. And the data in our state gives me hope because we're already doing it. We can already see the results of your investments, of your amazing good work in Washington's data. So this is a slide about people who report that they get their social emotional needs met in their life. So among people who say, I rarely or never receive support, those are the blue bars. I sometimes receive support, those are the brown bars. And I always or usually have my social emotional support needs met. So we asked this question of the adults in Washington, and what we found was astounding. We found the same kind of dose-response pattern, but in the other direction, in the positive direction. So this first group is people with cardiovascular disease. These are people who reported that they do have cardiovascular disease, but their symptoms are decreased based on the amount of support they have. We see a lower prevalence of diabetes. These are stress-related conditions, so it makes sense that having more social emotional support in your life, having more people helping you, would reduce stress and would reduce the symptoms of stress-related disease. And we see that reduction here for people with diabetes. And the biggest impact we see is the impact on people who rarely or never receive support are reporting needing mental health treatment at the rate of 15, almost 16%. But people who say, I do get support, only 1.4% needing treatment for mental health conditions. And we can cross-reference this and look by ACEs, and we see a profound impact even among the highest ACE populations. So we can reduce the symptoms, the mental health symptoms, by increasing belonging and helping people have more meaningful roles in community. I wanted to show you the impact on unemployment, and this really shocked us. The blue bars are folks that this high resilience scale is people who said they had social emotional support, always or usually. They had a positive view. They said, good things happened to me in my life. And they had hope. They reported having hope. And we see this phenomenal impact. This is in 2009. Oh, go back. In 2009, when we're at the worst of the crash in the economy. And we saw even among people with very high ACEs, about the same unemployment rate all the way across the board, about the same as the general population, which was about 12% at that time. Whereas people who didn't have those resilience factors, you see this phenomenal dose-response relationship between ACEs and unemployment. And finally, I think one of the most important points to make today is communities are already successfully reducing the ACE scores of their youth. If we're able to disaggregate the communities and say which communities are actively coming together like you're doing today, learning from each other, really looking at the data, and making plans for collective impact from their work, we see this reduction in the percentage of young people aging into adulthood with 3 or more ACEs. So where communities were not coming together over the last 12 years, we saw a 38% of the youth with 3 or more ACEs. And in the places with robust processes for building the capacity of the community to solve problems, it drops clear down to 29%. This is the reason that this is such a powerful set of facts. Epidemiologists can calculate the percentage of a disease that's attributable to ACEs in this case. So almost 60% of risk for HIV, 56% of anxiety attributable to ACEs, 42, and you can read all the way around that large percentage of disease, somewhere between 20 and 70%, are attributable to ACEs depending on the condition. So what's exciting to me is that this is like putting a sponge in the middle of an oil slick. As we're effective in reducing ACEs among young people growing into adulthood, we can just pull that whole ACE attributable disease, and this entire circle will reduce at once. We no longer have to ploddingly reduce one thing at a time. So in closing, I just want to thank the Northwest Children's Foundation for their awesome insight about this. And they're working with their grantees, many of whom are leaders in the state, in reducing ACEs and reducing the effects of them. And next, we're going to hear from 3 of those organizations, one talking about taking a resilience point of view in a therapeutic setting, one talking about shifting programming, and another shifting organizational culture and planning. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much. I know there are questions out there, and we're going to hold off until a Q&A time, if that's okay. We're going to hear from 3 remarkable organizations. As Laura said, the first organization is working in the therapeutic setting with the ACEs research, and that's Jumping Mouse Children's Center. They're located in Port Townsend in Jefferson County. They do amazing work helping traumatized children heal through expressive mental health therapy. And we have with us today founder Dot Kelly, who's the clinical director, and Chris Becker, executive director.
My name is Chris Becker, and I'm the Executive Director of Jumping Mouse Children's Center, which was founded in Port Townsend in 1999, specifically to address the need for specialized children's mental health services in Jefferson County. In the past 14 years, we've worked with more than 450 children, aged 2 to 12, who've suffered traumatic experiences, including abuse, neglect, or violence at home or in the community, substance abuse as well. In 2012, of the 82 kids in our program, 53% had experienced domestic violence, 54% lived in single-parent homes, 37% were in foster, adoptive, or kinship care, nearly a quarter had been homeless, and more than half had been impacted by a caregiver's substance abuse. Of our kids' caregivers in 2012, 60% had experienced domestic violence, 37% had been sexually abused, more than a third had been homeless, and 15% had lost the care of their own parents in childhood. So clearly ours is a very vulnerable population that has experienced a lot of adversity. And one of the earliest trauma-informed decisions made at Jumping Mouse was to locate our clinic in a home. We wanted to create a place that felt relaxed and welcoming and provided a warm and supportive setting in which to build trusting relationships. Entry into therapy or parent consulting sessions is through our front door and into our living room, which we've furnished with soft couches and chairs and a beanbag for kids. And then the children's therapy rooms are situated in what would be the bedrooms in our home's full floor plan. Each room contains trays for wet and dry sand, along with many toys displayed on shelves for the children to choose. We also have soft toys, baby dolls, playhouses, and play kitchens, and many other items that evoke experiences that the child chooses to share. At this point, Dot's going to tell you a story of a particular child and mother who came to Jumping Mouse for help.
So Jenny, the mother in this narrative, has 2 children. Her oldest was 12 years old, and her youngest, Samuel, was 6 when she called Jumping Mouse Children's Center. Earlier that week, Sam had been getting into Mom's car to transit home from his dad's house. Sam claimed he didn't want to go, and Dad supported this breach in the parenting plan. Sam began screaming that his mom was hurting him, and neighbors called the police. Jenny was thrust into motion from fear caused by police intervention and the possibility that her child would be taken from her. Her shame in not handling this scene also erupted. Not long after Sam started in therapy, Jenny asked to see someone in our Securing Connections program for her own support. And her overwhelming question was, when is this going to be about me? What we know about adverse childhood experiences is that memory carries a sort of anniversary calendar of childhood events. What is important to note in this situation is that Jenny herself had been put into foster care at age 12, the age her oldest was when this event occurred. Jenny's own responsibilities for her 2 children had become chronically overwhelming. While remembering comes naturally for many of us, Jenny had no memories of her own early childhood. When her 6-year-old started therapy, she began to have early memories of her mother's drunken behaviors, of feeding and caring for her own younger siblings, and of finally being taken into foster care. Jenny's adverse childhood experience score is 9. Sam's score is 7. The father of these 2 children was also in foster care from 10 years on, and he too suffered from parent neglect and addiction. People with higher scores of adverse childhood experiences, often have barriers to what they can remember, and what they do remember is often disjointed. The disjointedness is a safety mechanism, a way to protect ourselves as children from what is too harsh. Jenny's unsayable memories are too much to carry alone. Sam, in this stage of building his own childhood experiences, or his own childhood memories, has maintained a very either-or response, either reactive or non-caring. He could be very excited and articulate about the bands he followed on YouTube, but at the same time, he substituted names for the people he lived with. Sam's therapist had a difficult time knowing what to build rapport with. When the therapist called Sam's mom to check reality, Jenny didn't return the calls. We seemed to be in that limbo place with them both, shooting in the dark. Sam could be called a liar. He wasn't. He was using a well-designed hide-and-seek method to defend against his own sense of shame and unlovability. Additionally, Sam's emotional health was impacting his physiology. He was very overweight, and he has a hard time moving agilely. Sam's therapist recognized that Sam needed to prepare for a trustworthy relationship before he could participate in taking that risk. They often walked to the school play yard together to swing. As Sam's body remained in this young, lolling rhythm, he could face talking a bit more easily. During that time, he wasn't required to be in eye-to-eye contact. When we apply our knowledge of adverse childhood experiences here, we know that Sam would need to be in a receptive state in order to tolerate a deeper, congruent connection. Near the end of the first year together, Sam began trusting his therapist with some of the troubling experiences that were continuing to impact him. As they pieced those experiences together, it was essential that the therapist remain in a place of compassion. Had the adult attempted to correct Sam's stories, Sam would have needed to construct yet better hiding places. The therapist accepted those hiding places while simultaneously expressing a coherent narrative that both of them could rely on. Sam learned to follow this guidance rather than trick the therapist into not seeing his bad self. Slowly but surely, as his dad went in and out of jail, Sam witnessed ongoing domestic violence, and a girlfriend had a baby she abandoned to Sam's dad. While all these adversities continued, Sam remained somewhat receptive to his therapist's guidance. When something was too scary, the two slowed down and mitigated that dread, and then started again in safe enough relationship. At this point in time, Sam can self-correct some of his trauma truths. Sam's mother, Jenny, has been in our Securing Connections program for 3 years. She does the best she can to offer her children love. She is very challenged, and she knows this. Our therapist in this program, Catherine, found that laughter is one pretty useful tool and often uses the kind of reflection one uses with a child, with the respect needed in adult relationship. When Jenny is able to laugh at herself, Catherine can say, "I love seeing your smile, it just lights up the place." At first, as the work began to respond to Jenny's plea, "What about me?" Jenny would suddenly disappear for unknown lengths of time. Catherine would call and leave a message. "I'm glad you called last month, and I hope you're doing all right. Call me soon. Our time is still on Thursday morning." You can see the hide-and-seek defense that is shared between mom and son. Sam told stories, and Jenny disappeared. Both of these behaviors deflect building trust. We can see where trust has been profoundly violated, and it is here that therapy and support must focus. At first, Jenny wouldn't return any calls from Sam's therapist. Now, 3 years later, she's calling him for consultation regarding her son, and she's committed to the future. She says she expects Sam's therapist to attend her son's high school graduation. Trusting this longevity is vital to healing attachment wounds. When working with children and parents who have both been impacted by ACEs, we need to bear in mind that we won't be able to reset the dial to 0 and begin again, but we will rebalance the scales, and introduce new, increasingly healthy ways to make choices around relationship, trust, reliability. The reparenting that must occur takes time. If we are to wrap our heads around what abuse and neglect can do to a human being, when these experiences are not seen and are kept away in an unsayable space, we need to accept that time is our best offering. Adverse childhood experiences are maps in our brains, and we must walk together to alleviate the harsh voices that have been internalized. Adverse childhood experiences have brought forward the notion that compassion and time heal much more firmly and deeply than instruction and efficiency. Thank you.
I'd just like to emphasize again the context of mending that takes place at Jumping Mouse. As the example that Dot presented clearly shows, healing does take time, months or even years. And the fact that we're located where we are in a small town in a rural county, I believe both enables and requires this long-term approach. When you live in a small community, paths between neighbors, colleagues, peers, friends, they all intersect very frequently. And it's really hard to look away from someone if you know that they're suffering. Because we have fewer resources and services nearby, it's also necessary for every agency to fulfill its role fully and to build strong relationships with the other teams who are picking up where you've left off or carrying the family before you come in. I think Port Townsend and Jefferson County understand this, and the language of ACEs and the new understanding of ACEs has really helped us to pull together across sectors for the health of our clients, for each other, and for the whole community.
I think we're all very glad that Jumping Mouse exists. Here you go. We are next going to be learning about how ACEs research has been useful in parent education programming. And we'll be hearing from Parent Trust for Washington Children. They're located in King County in Seattle, but they have programs statewide. For over 30 years, they've provided parent education and support for families. So today, we're going to be hearing from Rita Pinchot, a facilitator in the Parent Trust Families and Recovery Group. And we're very lucky also to have Lacey Block, a participant in the Families in Recovery Group. Welcome.
Hi, so I'm going to start and just kind of explain the Families in Recovery program, which I work for. I am a group facilitator for the Families in Recovery program of Parent Trust for Washington Children. And the Families in Recovery program works within chemical dependency treatment centers with parents, building social support networks with the parents. We meet weekly to discuss how things are going with the parents and provide a space for parents to support each other and get feedback on different things that are going on with them throughout the week. So when our program director started sending us information about the ACEs, we decided that this was just something we had to start incorporating into our groups because if you can see, this is not going to be something I'm great at. There we go. You can see here, this shows the adverse childhood experiences that are experienced by families in recovery group participants compared to the general population. And so the parents that we're working with in our Families in Recovery programs have experienced some of the things that we've been talking about today at higher rates than the general population. You can see here that 46% of our participants have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So this is definitely something that we have in the last year been working to address in our groups. So we have 3 different groups that have been working on incorporating the ACEs information, 2 at perinatal treatment services and 1 at Genesis House. And we're sort of piloting a project here, so myself and another colleague are trying to work on how to best do this within a support group setting, how we can best provide some strategies for parents to prevent ACEs in the future generation. So where we started is just kind of first giving tools to parents, starting out by saying, okay, so we know that our parents are experiencing higher rates of ACEs than the general population. So when we're going into these discussions, we're going to be talking with parents who have experienced all kind of traumas in their past, and we don't want to be a therapeutic environment because we have the fortunate experience of working in a group where the parents are already surrounded by supportive services, which is just wonderful. So they have therapists and chemical dependency counselors and case managers, sometimes CPS caseworkers that are all working around these parents to help. And so our focus is more to build some protective factors and give them tools to work with their children rather than, hash through the traumas from their past. So we started out, my colleague Mary at her group in Genesis House started out by just having a group speaker come and talk to the parents about how to have healthy conversations around sexuality. So it kind of broke the ice for talking about things like sex that is sometimes very difficult for people who have experienced trauma, and just for parents in general if you're thinking about how to talk to these things about your kids. With your kids. So starting out with that kind of helped parents go into this discussion about the ACEs that they have experienced and that their children have experienced, kind of already feeling like they had some tools ready. So, okay, maybe I have experienced some abuse in my past, but I already know going into this discussion some things that I can do to help my kids either not experience that or to deal with the abuse that has already occurred and move forward from there. So what we've been doing in the groups is using a questionnaire that kind of talks about the 10 different categories that Laura showed in her discussion. And so we'll hand that out to parents and say, let's look this over and say, you don't need to share with anybody, but what have you experienced? What have your kids experienced? And then kind of let the parents guide the discussion based on what they need. And so our goal is not to really get into the nitty-gritty about what's happened, but really just to kind of take a look at this. And so in our first discussion in group, one thing that was a really powerful story for me is a mom, Sarah, who she was 23 and a mother of 4, but pregnant with her 5th. And she was residing in this chemical dependency treatment center, working on reuniting with her children. She had one child there with her and then one on the way, and was working on getting the other 3 back. And so we had this discussion, and at first, looked over the questionnaire and threw it on the ground and said, I can't do this, actually. So I was like, that's fine. Nobody has to participate in these discussions because it's pretty intense for some people, and we totally get that. And so going from there, she, after some other group members started kind of sharing what they had discovered on the questionnaire and saying, oh yeah, I actually have 8 ACEs. That's kind of crazy. She picked it back up and then said, I'm looking at this and I never had any idea that any of the stuff that happened to me as a kid had anything to do with where I'm at now. And so that was like this incredible moment for us when we're thinking about how to incorporate this information into our groups. Say, aha, that's it. That's, she's now realizing that those things have impacted her and can start working on that for herself, and also start realizing what she needs to do with her children to move forward. So what we have learned in the discussions that we've had so far, and again, we're piloting a project, so we're just kind of starting to figure out how to incorporate this information into a more community-based, strengths-focused setting. What we've learned is that something that can be really powerful for parents is just the piece of self-disclosure, not necessarily having the group facilitator say, these things happened to me, but just saying, I have 2 or 3 ACEs, and that's totally normal because, we are seeing statewide that, 62% of people in our state have experienced some ACEs. So that kind of normalizes the conversation and takes some of that high tension out of it. So kind of using that as a tool has become something that we're doing in our group. And then we've also realized through the discussions that rather than focusing on the particular ACEs that the parents have had, that it's really helpful to focus on prevention. So that's, in our first discussions, we were kind of doing more of a parent-led discussion about what had happened and what kind of support they needed about that and connecting there. And what we've moved towards and realized is more important is kind of saying, okay, maybe these things have happened. What has happened with your kids, and what can we do about that? So one of my favorite strategies that Mary has used in her groups at Genesis House is making a prevention list. So saying, okay, what are some things we can do to prevent your kids from being abused, or what are some things we can do to keep your kids safe, really, and making a list there that parents can refer to and hanging it up. And then the next week when we see the parents saying, what did you read a book with your kid? Wow, that is so awesome, because you're totally building a more nurturing relationship, which is preventing ACEs. And so where we're going with that is really trying more and more to thread this information throughout our support groups instead of kind of the more individualized discussions, moving towards just each group kind of focusing on the prevention and how things are going, what strategies have been working with kids or with parents and with their kids, and focusing on building supports. So some of the ways we're doing that are by identifying triggers with the children and the self. So I had a mom in my group who she had experienced sexual abuse in her past and was having a really difficult time not hitting her kid when he would touch her. And so they were having some issues creating boundaries so that she could feel safe and he could feel safe. And so when we had this ACE discussion in our group, she was like, oh my gosh, that's totally why. That's why I'm having such a hard time when he wants to get in the shower with me. It's because this happened to me as a kid. It was like she hadn't quite connected the dots until she looked at this questionnaire and said, yeah, some things have happened to me and that's affecting my parenting, and actually some things are happening to him and we need to stop it. And so she was kind of able to work with her therapist around that, and then also within our group discussions think of some ways to prevent that, just by setting boundaries with her son and being okay with that. You don't necessarily have to let him get in the shower with you. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. And then the other thing we're doing to kind of build some resiliency around parents and kids is including a stress management piece. So I talked about we'll have people from outside. We had Amy Lane come from Birds and Bees and Kids and talk about how to have healthy conversations around sexuality with kids. And then we'll also have Marnie Port who works with Parent Trust and does a stress management and resource training for parents and for children. And so she will come in and do a little training with the parents then too, so that they can kind of learn to manage their stress and start thinking about ways to coach their children to deal with the stresses that come up from living with a parent that may have experienced ACEs and maybe have experienced ACEs themselves. So that's kind of where we're at as far as how we're using the information from ACEs, and we're super excited to just keep moving forward and utilize this in all of our groups and our Circle of Parents groups and the rest of our families and recovery groups throughout Washington State. I'm going to turn it over to Lacey now, and she's going to talk a bit about what it's like to be a parent in one of these groups where we're having these discussions.
Well, I am a participant in Families in Recovery. I actually am a client at Perinatal Treatment Services, and I did the shortened version of the ACEs questionnaire for myself and then for my daughter, Olivia, who's 5. Growing up, I lived with 2 parents that struggled with alcohol, which I now as an adult do as well. And my goal for my own parenting was to never allow my daughter to witness what I did as a child. It was never physical, but the emotional abuse, the hostility and the environment, I never wanted that for my daughter. However, after doing the ACEs quiz, I realized that my daughter actually has a higher score than I do at 5 years old. So for me, that was extremely heartbreaking. It seems that all my attempts to shield her from that lifestyle didn't work. So knowing this information is extremely important to me because it allows me to realize what I need to change in my life to allow my child to move on. And I can't change my past, but I can change the future that we have laid out in front of us. I have become more open about my emotions with my daughter because that is a big thing that I experienced as a child. My mom was very depressed. I realized that I'm a very depressed person, and so I never linked that with parenting. I thought that was separate, but in fact it is not. My emotions are very much a part of my daughter's life, so it is important for me to make sure that I am emotionally healthy for her. So I have taken a lot of steps with that. I also know that my mother and father never got along, and I actually do not get along with my own father. So I have made an effort to mend that relationship and form healthy boundaries with people in my life for my daughter's sake. And I hope to basically just provide a happier environment for her. And it is, like I said, it has opened my eyes to how much my emotional disposition affects my daughter. So, yeah.
So one last quick thing that I forgot to say is that we're finding some really exciting preliminary results when we're looking at achievement rates in our families and recovery groups. And this is just, super preliminary, super small numbers that we're dealing with. But we are showing that after we've had these ACE discussions in our group, that parents are reporting better family management skills, that they're feeling like they have more healthy, nurturing relationships with their children, and feeling like they have more social support, which is really one of the main goals of our families and families and recovery program as a whole, is that social support piece. So it's really exciting to see where we're going. And yeah, thanks, and thanks, Lacey.
Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you so much, Lacey, for sharing that with us. It brings the whole ACEs research into a really kind of a concrete focus for us. Thank you. We're next going to hear from Brigid Collins Family Support Center. And we're going to be meeting the Executive Director, Byron Mannering. And what he's going to focus on is to tell us a little bit about how the ACEs research has affected the strategic direction and kind of the organizational culture of Brigid Collins. They're located in Bellingham in Whatcom County. They provide support programs for families as a means to prevent child abuse and a wide range of services to help families who have experienced abuse heal and move forward. Byron?
Thank you, Victoria. I think I'm representing gender diversity here. That's kind of common in my field, so maybe that's one of the strategies that we should take, is getting more men involved in this work. I first heard about ACEs back in 2005, and I got to do a shout out to my buds and colleagues in Whatcom County, the Whatcom Family and Community Network. Kathy Adams and the Executive Director, Jeff Morgan, are back there right now, and they brought ACEs to our community back in 2005 and have just been a leader in our community for such a long time. And so I wanted to say thank you to that. I'm glad this is a conversation because I'm kind of making this up. Well, one of the things that happened for me recently is just the understanding that what ACEs has brought to us is the importance of our workforce development. You know, how our workforce is actually bringing this to bear. And one of the most important things that's happening, of course, is in relationship to child evidence-based practices. And evidence-based practices that I want to get our logo up there. Our evidence-based practices that we bring into to our community there's a number of those different programs, but there's one aspect to them that we've been struggling with for a long time to try to make happen, and that is the area of bringing in the capacity to look at this work from a compassionate and non-judgmental perspective. Now, that's a hard and tough thing to accomplish. especially when you're working with a family or a child or a parent, and they seemingly are doing something like that doesn't seem to be in your best interest, that seems to be wrong. And so our abilities to actually do that is really important, because it actually taps into kind of our own triggers and our own problems and issues. So when we're directly working with families, this is a very important issue, and I'm going to show you some slides in a little bit about that. But where this came to mind for me was we had this little boy came into the office the other day, and I was watching, and he was out in the waiting room, and he was having this major tantrum. And, because we've been working with adverse childhood experiences and kind of understanding what's going on, first thing I thought was, what's happening to this child? Now, before I learned about ACEs and started working this, I'd say, what's wrong with this child? So there's a difference between that, and it's a very subtle difference, but our tendency is always to come forward with this. What's wrong with you? How are we going to fix this? And I was thinking, we got great evidence-based practices. He's going to go to PCIT, and how's it going to fix him? And it's like, no. What's wrong with this child? And then this image of the brain came, in mind, and I started seeing the ACEs and the damage that was done to him. And then I started thinking, he's developed these patterns to address that injury that happened to him. These are things that he's doing to protect himself, to heal his injuries. And I was like, who am I to tell this child that your behaviors are wrong? These are the behaviors that he's been using all his life to protect himself and nurture himself. And so then all of a sudden I started thinking, wow, well, what are we doing here with our evidence-based programs? And the one program he was coming to was PCIT, Parent-Child Interaction Therapy. And one of the things that we do with that is ignore. So all the staff and the parent, while this child was having his tantrum, we were all sitting around ignoring the behavior and talking and letting him go through there. And that felt good to me all of a sudden. It felt compassionate to allow him to use whatever he needed to get through that particular moment in time. So this is a very important thing. And then what I started thinking about, what does the PCIT do? It starts giving him another option for how to respond to these situations. This was a transition time. Transition times are always tough. But here's another option. So over and over, that's what's happening with PCIT anyway, is we're giving the child another options to respond differently, to create a new brain pattern, and to allow him to keep his old one. It's a security blanket. Hopefully, and what I think happens with the evidence-based program is that, he starts to like this new brain pattern. And so the other one just kind of stops being used so much and starts atrophying. That all of a sudden said, wow, okay, I get it. That's why these evidence-based practices are so effective. So I told my clinical director that, and she goes, duh. Well, that's because I'm the executive director and I sit in front of my desk thinking and making things up. And so this is what I made up. This is what I made up here. Where does it fit? Where does ACEs fit in our evidence-based practices component here? And what you see up here is I've kind of broken things down because I get confused when we start talking about evidence-based practices from PCIT to ACEs. And it's not a practice, but it has research in it. And it's kind of, in my field, it's kind of getting all blurred. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll try to kind of categorize some of these things. And so, what we have here is, what I've set up is that, we have all these programs, I call them intervention models. They're instructional types of models. They're manualized things that we're doing. And our state is really working hard, and our agency has worked very hard on putting these programs together. Incredible Years, Positive Parenting programs. These are all programs that require a lot of fidelity to the model, and so we worked really hard to bring these up, and we've been doing this for quite some time. But what we were finding is as we were getting success with those programs, we were still struggling with engagement issues. And we were still struggling with retention issues. And so, okay, well, now what do we do about that? And of course, then there's this communication piece. We wanted to get really, really good at communication, so we looked for another, quote, research-informed or supported program, and we came up with motivational interviewing. And so this is about relationships. So we started working really hard with this particular piece, and we started seeing success. But as we looked at that research on motivational interviewing, what it said was that 20% of the success of the program is related to the technique. 80% is related to the spirit within which the person's bringing this technique and its place. It's the place of being. What are they being? What's that provider being when they're delivering this model? So, okay, we're going to start working on that. But when we started looking at where are you being, this is where I talked about earlier. It's like, this is not easy. It brings up triggers for all of us. And so we started thinking about, and so that's where I started looking at, well, where are these other things? And of course, when I started talking about this to our program director, she says, yeah, we're training our staff in trauma-informed care. She's always a step ahead of me. That's a cool thing, actually, to have. And the drama triangle. And this is where ACEs goes. I mean, for me, when we start looking at triggers, we can start looking at our own issues and our own kind of ACEs informed, our own brain patterns, whether they are there. And it kind of gives the space that says, okay, it's okay to not get triggered here. We work on that when the triggers come up to kind of avoid those things from happening, or to kind of get ourselves back into the present moment and to be in the particular space that's available for them. So ACEs actually opened up that opportunity for us to actually be okay with being compassionate and non-judgmental. Now, this means a lot to me because I grew up in Oklahoma, which is the capital of judgment. So it's hard for me to stay in a space of being non-judgmental. But I want to read a couple of things about this, about a story. Well, really, their homework. We train really hard. We have a whole model for how we get our families, our workers to this place. And they have to do homework. And so this homework assignment, we were working on the trauma-informed care, and they watched a video called Path of the Horse. We actually are learning a lot about how to do this by watching horse trainers, and it's a pretty amazing type of a thing. So they watch this, and then they have to do homework on it in relationship to it. So I wanted to tell you how our hard work in all of these areas is kind of showing up. And here's one. It says this is one of the families from one of our Native American communities up north, and she took the quote from this video. It says, "Emotions move through the air like sounds." This is a learning that we have to have when we step in front of these families or in there. She says, "I've learned a lot of communication styles and of the importance of silence while working with the Lummi community. Culturally, there seems to be a calmer tone of voice and just an overall pause between comments. I really enjoyed the discussion in The Path of the Horse about how emotions move through the air like sounds. I learned that people can participate non-verbally and that the participation does not require verbal conversations, and we can support a family's efforts to make change simply by being present. I think for me, learning to be okay with silences with these families has taught me a lot. It offers a softness and a gentle support instead of coming with an agenda for immediate change." This is not how the broader community, public, private, folks in the child welfare system operate as a whole. We come with agendas. So how do we get ourselves to that place? I kind of think like we just need to turn things on its head. I always like mixing stuff up. When we started this at Brigid Collins, We focused so hard on the programs and the intervention models, and when we saw they weren't working, then that's where we did all our training with folks, and then we brought these other pieces together, and we're struggling right now, with getting ourselves to the place of these principles of care. What I think we need to start looking at is actually kind of turning that around a little bit, and as new folks are coming in to our system, new folks are actually being recruited and trained and educated in our community. We need to focus in on these principled models, because what I found as we see our new folks come in, because our new folks that are coming into our agency, they're getting that. I mean, they're just getting a heavy dose of these principled models right off the bat. The other types of fidelities to the model stuff goes away, but we have less and less struggle as they move into these techniques and understanding the techniques and being in that spirit. And they have very, all of a sudden, oh, this makes sense. I don't mind jumping through all these hoops on these techniques or these programs that we're doing. So I think this is a really important thing, and I think we're missing it because it is a hard thing for folks. And what this is, this principle model things, is that it really is an acknowledgement that we as providers, as organizations, and as a state and as communities, we're only going to be as effective in getting better at what we do as we are as effective as our own personal changes that we're making. So this is what I am thinking is a really important thing. This is what our agency is doing in terms of making that change. I have one other thought about ACEs, is that ACEs is really the ability to kind of see where your community is in relation to ACEs is quite exciting. And our community health assessment, a recent community health assessment tool thing that came out in Whatcom County, said one of the things they want to do is they want to determine the health of the community and how we're doing by what's the kind of average number of ACEs per capita that we have in our community. Great limit. I mean, boy, if we can just kind of look at that and continue to reduce that, what a great opportunity it is. Now, that might sound pretty hard to do. Well, how are we going to measure that? Well, I have to point to the Whatcom Family Community Network over here again, who are doing some great work with some research that they're doing. And they've actually developed and put into the middle schools or into one middle school and tested out, including the ACEs scores or ACEs questions into their community health survey. And so they got a whole cohort of 6th graders, 7th graders, and 8th graders, and they got that information out. Now, if we were to do that countywide, if we were to do that statewide, then we're going to actually start seeing where these ACEs are starting to show up, and it's a good way that we can actually use as a measure, and it's a simple way. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say today, so thank you for having us, and thanks to the Northwest Children's Fund.
Thank you so much, Byron. I just want to give a big hand to all three organizations for the very difficult and critical work that you're doing every day. And this is where the conversation begins. So we're going to take a brief transition period, and we're going to have a panel up here, and if you have had a chance to write on your cards any questions that you have, please hold them up and we'll get them from you. Okay, thank you.